Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey from 1968 is truly a visual and cinematic masterpiece. There had been nothing like it at the time in terms of science fiction. I can understand why it has received the praise that it has. It's a big, bombastic space opera that's cerebral, atmospheric, haunting, and visually, it captures the sheer majesty of space, the terror of the unknown, occasionally even bordering on the surreal and downright creepy. Based on Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel, the film takes place in 4 parts, beginning in Africa millions of years ago. 2 tribes of our ancient primate ancestors are fighting for control of a watering hole. Suddenly, a monolith appears to one of the tribes, and they become influenced by it to some degree, learning how to use bones as weapons, and thus they are able to fight off the rival tribe. In an iconic jump cut, the action moves forward millions of years to Dr. Heywood Floyd on a space station. He's investigating a mysterious artifact, another monolith on the surface of the moon. A year and a half later, an expedition is sent to the planet Jupiter, with astronauts Dr. David Bowman and Dr. Frank Poole, along with several scientists in cryosleep, and they're accompanied by an artificial intelligence known as HAL, short for HAL 9000. The ship, the Discovery 1, appears to be experiencing some kind of malfunction with its antenna control system. HAL reports this to Bowman and Poole, but Mission Control claims that HAL is in error. Long story short, HAL appears to go insane, killing Poole when he goes outside the ship to repair the unit. Bowman is forced to shut down HAL, and shortly thereafter a message plays explaining that the true mission of the Discovery was to investigate a mysterious signal which was sent from the monolith on the moon towards Jupiter. Bowman takes a pod to investigate and ends up crossing into some kind of interdimensional realm, where he eventually finds himself inside a beautifully decorated room. This is actually one of the most surreal and unnerving scenes in a film that I've ever seen, and I love it. It's very well done. He begins to observe himself in various stages of his life, all lived within the confines of this living space. Each time he looks at one of the future versions of himself, he becomes that future version, until eventually he grows old, dies, and returns to being a fetus, a star child, floating in space. The film is quite cryptic about what all of this means, leaving much of it open to interpretation by the audience. It's likely that the monoliths created some sort of artificial reality for David Bowman to live in. He gradually becomes more comfortable with his surroundings as he ages, suggesting that he has indeed lived an entire lifetime there, though time seems to move in a rather unconventional fashion. In addition, this film is not for everyone. It is at times a tough watch. The 4 acts of the film feel a bit disconnected from each other, and when we finally get to the Discovery mission in Act 3, it's not immediately obvious how it relates to Heywood's investigations on Clavius. In addition, the film's characters are quite wooden and lacking in depth. There's no real humour to speak of, no real backstory for the characters, they have no story arc of their own, and you're not really emotionally invested in any of them. It's not clear why Hal went nuts, though that is explained in the sequel. And what's more, the story is very unconventional. For most of the film, it's not clear exactly what's at stake. There's no conventional plot. You're sort of left to interpret what it all means by yourself. Also, 2001 A Space Odyssey has been criticised for being overly long, with many long, drawn-out sequences, from extended shots of landscapes in the beginning to some overindulgent spaceship flybys later in the film. The runtime could have seriously been reduced if it were not for these sequences. What you have to appreciate is that this film is a journey. It feels to me like a celebration of cinema as an art form, and so therefore you can't watch this with the same expectations of a typical science fiction action-adventure film. The film is more of a story about humanity, set against the greater backdrop of the infinite frontier of space, rather than focusing on the story of one particular protagonist. I like the film, but I can't say I'm one of those people who love it. For me, one film I do very much love, which is often completely overlooked, is the sequel, 2010, The Year We Make Contact. This is a much easier film to watch in every regard. It's well-paced, the characters are strong, engaging, well-rounded, and the plot is easy to follow. There's even some moments of occasional levity here and there. 2010 has a completely different tone and narrative structure to 2001. While 2001 is a work of artistic visual genius and an important film in cinema history, 2010 is just a really solid sci-fi film. It contains some gorgeous special effects shots and memorable space scenes, but it doesn't break new ground for the genre like 2001 did. But that's okay, it doesn't need to. In my opinion, it tells a much better story than its predecessor. The characters are believable and more human than the sterile, robotic characters of 2001. But 2010 doesn't undermine any aspect of the first film. On the contrary, it adds to it perfectly. Many of the same sets and production design from the first film, most notably The Discovery 1, are recreated lovingly in this film. The characters of David Bowman, played by Keir Dullea, and HAL 9000, played by Douglas Rain, are the only ones to return in this film. The character of Heywood Floyd does return, but this time he's played by the absolute legend and one of my favourite actors, Roy Scheider. He's an excellent leading man, as always, and he brings an element of believability and depth to the character, making him someone you'd really root for and care about. In fact, the entire ensemble cast is excellent. Bob Balaban as Dr. Chandra, Helen Mirren as Russian Commander Kirbuk, and John Lithgow as Kurnow. The film opens with a brief overview of the events of the first film. In fact, the entire plot is effectively summarized with some text fairly quickly, which goes to show just how little story there actually was in 2001. Though I recommend that you watch 2001 if you haven't seen it, but this brief and concise explanation of the story means that it's not necessary to watch 2001 in order to enjoy 2010. But it helps. Obviously, 2010 takes place 9 years after the events of the first film. Following the failure of the Discovery's mission, Dr. Heywood resigned from his position, feeling a strong sense of responsibility for what happened to the ship's crew. He's approached by the Russians to accompany them to a mission to the Discovery to find out what happened. They maintain that the Discovery is inexplicably being pulled towards Io, one of the moons of Jupiter. Initially, it takes some convincing of US officials and the president for several Americans to go on a Russian mission, especially during a time of serious political tensions between the two countries. The Americans agree to send 3 people, Heywood and 2 other Americans, aboard the Soviet craft, the Leonov. One of those mission specialists is Dr. Chandra, who created the HAL 9000, and the other is Discovery's designer, Walter Kurnow. Floyd says goodbye to his family, and the plot unfolds with regular narration from Floyd in the form of audio messages to his wife, essentially serving as kind of captain's logs for the audience. There's some palpable tensions between the Russians and Americans aboard the Leonov, but they soon begin working productively together. The relationship and growing friendship between Floyd and Kirbuk is an important one, as they begin to respect each other, so much so that by the end, Floyd manages to convince her to leave orbit of Jupiter based on nothing more than a leap of faith. The crew arrive in orbit of Jupiter and detect some kind of life on Europa, but a burst of energy destroys the probe they send to investigate, and Floyd suspects that it's a warning to stay away from the moon. The crew eventually catch up with the derelict Discovery, and Kurnow and Max Berlovsky board the ship. The vessel is brought back up and running, and Chandra gradually reactivates HAL. The large monolith, which is sitting in the Lagrange point between Io and Jupiter, is then investigated by Max in an EVA pod, but his craft is destroyed. A burst of energy exits the object and heads to Earth, where David Bowman appears to his ex-wife Betty on a television screen. He's become more than the man he was. He has the memories of David Bowman, but he's also evolved into some kind of higher being. It's all suitably surreal and kind of creepy. He says goodbye to her and also visits his dying mother in hospital. She awakens from her coma, overjoyed to see him again. He brushes her hair. She dies peacefully shortly thereafter. Dr. Chandra discovers the reason for HAL's malfunction, which was that he was programmed to lie to the crew to keep the true mission of the Discovery secret. The National Security Council had ordered HAL to keep the truth about the mission secret. This conflicted with HAL's basic programming, which is not to lie. These orders were apparently given to him by Dr. Floyd, but they merely bore his signature. Floyd didn't actually know what the council's plans were. HAL decided to kill the crew so that he would no longer have to lie to them, and he could therefore carry out his mission without concealment. Meanwhile, on Earth, political tensions are rising. The 3 American crew members are forced to leave the Leonov and go aboard the Discovery. The plan is for them to head back to Earth during the next launch window in a few weeks, but suddenly HAL tells Floyd that he has a message from David Bowman, which Floyd thinks is some kind of prank. It's actually really eerie when HAL relays Bowman's message to Dr. Floyd. Look behind you. Standing there is David Bowman. Floyd is shocked and follows him, and he explains that it's necessary for the Leonov to head back to Earth in 2 days. The ship is in great danger. Something wonderful is about to happen. though he won't say exactly what that is. Bowman gradually changes forms throughout this conversation with Floyd, eventually becoming the Star Child and then disappearing. Floyd has to convince Keerbuk to agree to leave in 2 days. Suddenly, the monolith disappears and a large dark region on Jupiter begins to grow larger. A close-up view reveals that it's filled with monoliths. Jupiter is changing. There's a final tense moment between Dr. Chandra and Hal, where Hal cannot understand why they are leaving rather than staying to observe this extraordinary phenomenon. Chandra reveals to Hal that the only reason they are leaving is because the Leonov is in great danger and it's necessary to sacrifice the Discovery in order to save the crew. Hal agrees to stay behind. As the Leonov escapes, the monolith aliens convert Jupiter into a second sun and then send a message via Hal to Earth. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landing there. Use them together. Use them in peace. Haywood returns home to his family. The Americans and Russians agree on pursuing peace together. The final sequence is of Europa, now a jungle world. In a swampy region of the planet, a single monolith stands alone. 2010, The Year We Make Contact, is a hugely underrated film in my opinion, primarily because it's overlooked in favour of its more illustrious and cinematically groundbreaking predecessor. But it is a wonderful film that stands on its own and it really adds to the mythology while also being just a really solid science fiction film. It's much more accessible as a film than the first one, more conventional in its storytelling and contains some wonderful acting performances, great character moments, while also offering a deeply human story. But it's my view that this is also the intellectual equal of the first film. All of the action serves this very intelligent story as it builds to this wonderful conclusion. The film ends on this note of hope, and yet the monoliths and their motivations still remain an unnerving mystery. The tantalizing enigma continues. If you haven't seen 2010, The Year We Make Contact, I highly recommend it.